Sarah Martinez never imagined that her quiet life as a small-town librarian would prepare her for what lay ahead. Growing up in the dusty plains of Montana, she learned to shoot from her grandfather, a former Marine who believed every person should know how to protect themselves. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, Sarah was learning to handle rifles with the precision of a seasoned marksman. The mountains surrounding Clearwater Valley had always been peaceful, until the day everything changed. Sarah worked at the town's only library, a modest building that served the community of barely 3,000 residents. She was known for her gentle demeanor and her ability to recommend the perfect book for any reader who walked through her doors. Nobody suspected that behind her quiet exterior lay the steady hands and sharp eyes of someone who could hit a target from incredible distances. The trouble began when a group of armed militants took control of the old mining facility on Copper Ridge just outside town. Led by a man named Marcus Kellerman, these individuals had been planning something sinister for months. They had stockpiled weapons, ammunition, and supplies in the abandoned mine shafts, turning the facility into a fortress. Local authorities initially thought it was just another group of survivalists seeking isolation, but they were gravely mistaken. When the militants announced their presence by blocking all access roads and declaring the area their sovereign territory, the situation escalated rapidly. They had chosen their location strategically. The mining facility sat on high ground with clear views of the entire valley below. From their position, they could monitor all movement in and out of Clearwater Valley, effectively trapping the residents. The first sign of real danger came when a local rancher tried to drive his cattle through what had always been public land. The militants opened fire without warning, killing 2 of his ranch hands and wounding the rancher himself. The message was clear. They would use deadly force against anyone who challenged their control. Within hours, the entire valley was under an unofficial siege. Sarah watched from her library window as military vehicles began arriving in town. The National Guard set up a command post in the high school gymnasium, while FBI negotiators established communication lines with the militants. The federal agents were confident they could resolve the situation peacefully, but as days turned into weeks, it became clear that Kellerman and his followers had no intention of surrendering. The militants had planned their operation meticulously. They had enough food and water to last months, and their position was nearly impregnable. The old mining facility was built into the mountainside, with multiple entrances and exits through the tunnel system. Any direct assault would result in massive casualties, making it impossible for law enforcement to take decisive action. As the standoff continued, life in Clearwater Valley became increasingly difficult. Supply trucks couldn't get through the roadblocks, and the militants had cut the main power lines to demonstrate their control. The townspeople lived in fear, never knowing when violence might erupt again. Children couldn't play outside, businesses remained closed, and families huddled in their homes waiting for the nightmare to end. Sarah found herself spending more time at the library than ever before. With most businesses shut down, the library became an unofficial community center where people gathered to share news and support each other. She organized reading groups for the children and provided a safe space for families to escape the tension that gripped the town. During quiet moments, Sarah would stand at the library's second-floor window, looking up at Copper Ridge through a pair of binoculars her grandfather had given her. She could see the militants moving around their positions, and she began to notice patterns in their behavior. Her years of hunting had taught her to observe and analyze, skills that were now proving unexpectedly valuable. The federal agents had been studying the situation for weeks, but they were outsiders who didn't understand the local terrain. Sarah, however, had grown up exploring every trail and canyon in the area. She knew the mountains better than anyone, including secret paths that didn't appear on any official map. This knowledge would soon become crucial in ways she never could have imagined. The situation deteriorated rapidly when the militants began targeting anyone who ventured too close to their perimeter. A news helicopter attempting to film the compound was shot down, killing both the pilot and reporter. The wreckage burned for hours on the mountainside, visible to everyone in the valley below. This act of violence sent shockwaves through the community and convinced federal authorities that they were dealing with extremely dangerous individuals. Agent Rebecca Torres, the FBI's lead negotiator, had been trying to establish meaningful dialogue with Kellerman for 3 weeks without success. The militant leader would only communicate through radio transmissions, delivering rambling speeches about government tyranny and his group's mission to establish a new order. His demands kept changing, making it impossible to find common ground for negotiations. Sarah had been watching the federal response with growing frustration. She could see tactical errors being made, positions being established in locations that left agents vulnerable to sniper fire from the ridge. Her grandfather's military training had taught her to think strategically about terrain and positioning, and she recognized that the authorities were at a significant disadvantage. The breaking point came when the militants captured 3 hikers who had unknowingly wandered into the restricted area. The young college students had been backpacking through the mountains when they stumbled upon the compound. Kellerman's followers dragged them inside and announced that they would be held as prisoners until their demands were met. The stakes had suddenly become much higher. Agent Torres called for additional resources, but the nearest military sniper teams were hundreds of miles away. The militants had chosen their timing perfectly, striking during a period when most specialized units were deployed overseas. The few marksmen available to local law enforcement lacked the training and equipment necessary for such a challenging shot across the valley. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She approached Agent Torres at the command post, introducing herself and explaining her background. At first, the federal agent was skeptical. Sarah looked more like a school teacher than a trained shooter. But when she described the precise distances and angles involved in various shooting positions around the valley, Torres began to take notice. To prove her capabilities, Sarah asked to be taken to the makeshift firing range that had been set up behind the high school. Using a borrowed rifle, she consistently hit targets at distances that impressed even the experienced agents. Her shots were not just accurate, they were placed with surgical precision, each bullet hitting within inches of where she had called it. Agent Torres was amazed by Sarah's skill, but she was also concerned about involving a civilian in such a dangerous operation. The FBI had strict protocols about using non-agents in tactical situations, and the legal implications were enormous. However, the captured hikers were running out of time, and conventional rescue options had been exhausted. Sarah explained that she knew of a position on the opposite ridge that would provide a clear line of sight to the compound. It was a location that military planners had overlooked, because it required climbing through treacherous terrain that appeared impassable on their maps. She had discovered the spot during childhood adventures and had often used it as a hunting blind. The position she described was nearly 2 miles from the target area, an extreme distance for any sniper shot. Most military marksmen considered anything beyond 1 mile to be nearly impossible due to factors like wind drift, bullet drop, and atmospheric conditions. But Sarah had been making long-range shots her entire life, and she understood the local weather patterns better than any outsider ever could. Agent Torres faced an agonizing decision. The lives of 3 innocent people hung in the balance, and conventional rescue attempts would likely result in their deaths. The militants had demonstrated their willingness to kill, and time was running out. After consulting with her superiors, she decided to let Sarah attempt what many would consider an impossible shot. Preparations began immediately for what would become one of the most challenging sniper operations in law enforcement history. Sarah would have to carry her equipment up a nearly vertical cliff face, establish a firing position in complete secrecy, and then make a shot that would test the very limits of human marksmanship. The margin for error was 0. If she missed, the hostages would certainly die. The federal agents initially doubted Sarah's plan, but their skepticism began to fade when she laid out detailed maps showing wind patterns, elevation changes, and atmospheric conditions that would affect a long-range shot. She had been studying these factors for years while hunting in the mountains, and her knowledge of local weather was more precise than any meteorological report. Sarah's grandfather had taught her that successful long-range shooting was more about understanding the environment than raw marksmanship skill. She explained how temperature inversions in the valley created predictable wind currents, and how the angle of the sun at different times of day would affect visibility and heat shimmer. The agents realized they were dealing with someone who understood ballistics at a level that matched their best snipers. Agent Torres arranged for Sarah to have access to military-grade equipment, including a specialized rifle designed for extreme long-range shooting. The weapon was fitted with a high-powered scope and equipped with subsonic ammunition that would reduce the sound signature. Every detail had to be perfect, because there would be no second chance. The climb to Sarah's chosen position began before dawn, with 2 federal agents accompanying her to provide security and communication support. The route she had selected was treacherous, requiring them to scale rock faces and navigate through narrow crevices that were barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The agents quickly understood why their tactical teams had never considered this approach. As they climbed higher, Sarah pointed out landmarks and explained how she had discovered this hidden path as a child. Her grandfather had taught her to explore the mountain systematically, always looking for alternative routes that others might miss. This childhood adventure was now providing the key to resolving a deadly crisis. The final stretch to the shooting position required them to crawl along a narrow ledge with a 1,000-foot drop on one side. The agents had to fight down their fear of heights while Sarah moved confidently across terrain she had navigated many times before. Her familiarity with every handhold and footstep was the only thing that made the approach possible. When they finally reached the concealed position, Sarah began setting up her equipment with methodical precision. She had brought weather monitoring instruments to track wind speed and direction, as well as a rangefinder to confirm the exact distance to her target. The initial measurements showed they were 3,047 yards from the compound, over 1.8 miles of open air that the bullet would have to traverse. The shooting position offered a perfect view of the militant compound while remaining completely hidden from observers below. Sarah had chosen the location because it was positioned behind a natural rock formation that provided both concealment and a stable platform for long-range shooting. From this vantage point, she could see the entire facility and identify the movements of individual militants. Through her scope, Sarah began studying the patterns of activity around the compound. She noticed that the militants maintained regular patrols and guard rotations, information that could be crucial for timing any rescue attempt. Her observations were radioed back to the command post, providing intelligence that had been impossible to gather from other positions. The challenge of the shot was becoming clearer as Sarah analyzed the environmental conditions. The bullet would have to travel through varying air densities and wind patterns, dropping nearly 60 feet due to gravity over the course of its flight. Additionally, the rotation of the Earth would cause the bullet to drift slightly during the several seconds it would take to reach its target. Agent Torres monitored the radio communications from the command post, where tension was building as news of the sniper operation spread through federal law enforcement channels. Senior officials in Washington were following the situation closely, and there was intense pressure to resolve the crisis before it escalated further. The unconventional nature of using a civilian marksman had raised concerns at the highest levels of government. Sarah remained focused on her preparations, checking and rechecking every calculation. She had brought a notebook filled with ballistic data that she had compiled over years of long-range shooting, including information about how different ammunition performed under various conditions. This personal database was proving more valuable than any computer modeling system. As the morning progressed, Sarah continued to observe the compound and refine her understanding of the target area. She identified the building where the hostages were being held and noted the positions of guards and weapons emplacements. The militants had established their defenses to prevent ground assault, but they had not anticipated the possibility of an attack from such an extreme distance. As Sarah continued her surveillance of the compound, a disturbing pattern emerged. The militants were becoming increasingly agitated, and their radio communications suggested they were preparing for something dramatic. Intelligence analysts at the command post had intercepted messages indicating that Kellerman planned to execute one of the hostages at sunset to demonstrate his resolve. The deadline created an urgent timeline for any rescue operation. Sarah had less than 8 hours to prepare for what would likely be the most important shot of her life. The pressure was enormous, but she drew strength from her grandfather's teachings about staying calm under stress. He had always told her that panic was the enemy of precision. Agent Torres climbed up to Sarah's position to personally assess the situation. When she looked through the scope and saw the incredible distance to the target, she finally understood the magnitude of what Sarah was attempting. The compound appeared as tiny dots on the mountainside, and identifying individual people required maximum magnification. Sarah explained her shooting plan in detail, showing how she would account for wind drift, bullet drop, and atmospheric conditions. She had calculated that the bullet would take approximately 4 seconds to reach its target, during which time the Earth's rotation would cause it to drift several inches to the right. These were calculations that few marksmen ever had to consider. The target selection process was crucial. Sarah needed to identify a shot that would create maximum chaos among the militants while minimizing risk to the hostages. Through careful observation, she had determined that Kellerman himself was the key target. His death would likely cause confusion and panic among his followers, potentially creating an opportunity for a rescue operation. Kellerman had established a routine of inspecting the compound's defenses each afternoon, always following the same route and timing. Sarah had been tracking his movements and noticed that he would be exposed for approximately 30 seconds while crossing an open area near the main building. This would be her window of opportunity. The communication equipment allowed Sarah to coordinate with tactical teams positioned around the valley. When she took her shot, ground units would need to move immediately to rescue the hostages before the militants could recover from the initial shock. The timing had to be perfect, or the entire operation would fail. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah made final adjustments to her rifle and scope. She had test-fired the weapon earlier to confirm its accuracy, and now she was fine-tuning the settings based on current atmospheric conditions. The temperature was dropping slightly as evening approached, which would affect the air density and bullet trajectory. The wind patterns were particularly challenging because they varied at different elevations between Sarah's position and the target. She had to account for crosswinds near the valley floor, updrafts along the mountainside, and the relatively calm air at higher altitudes. Her years of hunting experience had taught her to read these invisible currents like a roadmap. Agent Torres received word from the command post that Washington had approved the operation, but with significant reservations. The political implications of using a civilian sniper were enormous, and if anything went wrong, careers would be destroyed. The pressure on Sarah was intense, but she remained focused on the technical aspects of the shot. Sarah's radio crackled with updates from surveillance teams monitoring the compound. Kellerman was maintaining his usual schedule, which meant he would be in position for the shot within 2 hours. The tactical teams were moving into position for the rescue operation, and medical personnel were standing by to treat any wounded hostages. The psychological pressure of the situation was beginning to affect everyone except Sarah. She had entered a state of intense concentration that her grandfather had taught her to achieve during hunting trips. In this mental zone, all distractions faded away, and she became completely focused on the task ahead. Weather conditions were ideal for the shot, with minimal wind and excellent visibility. Sarah had been monitoring atmospheric pressure and humidity levels throughout the day, and all indicators suggested that the bullet would travel true to its target. The only variable she couldn't control was the human element, whether Kellerman would appear in the expected location at the predicted time. As the critical moment approached, Sarah began her final preparations. She checked her breathing technique, adjusted her body position for maximum stability, and verified that her scope settings matched her calculations. Every detail had been rehearsed, and now it was time to execute the plan that had been 6 months in the making. The tension reached its peak as Sarah settled into her final shooting position. She had been lying motionless for over an hour, controlling her breathing and monitoring wind conditions through her scope. The weight of 3 innocent lives rested on her ability to make an impossible shot, and she could feel the eyes of federal agents watching her every move. Through her radio earpiece, Sarah heard updates from spotters positioned around the valley. Kellerman was following his usual routine, but he seemed more agitated than normal. Intelligence suggested he was becoming paranoid about federal surveillance, which made his movements less predictable. Any deviation from his established pattern could ruin the carefully planned operation. Agent Torres provided a final briefing from the command post. Tactical teams were in position and ready to move the moment Sarah took her shot. Medical helicopters were standing by and evacuation routes had been cleared. The entire operation hinged on Sarah's marksmanship and the element of surprise. Sarah adjusted her scope one final time, accounting for the subtle changes in light as the sun moved lower in the sky. The angle of the shadows across the compound was shifting, which could affect her ability to clearly identify her target. She had practiced shooting in similar lighting conditions, but never with stakes this high. The radio crackled with confirmation that Kellerman was beginning his inspection tour. Sarah could see tiny figures moving around the compound through her scope, but at this distance, individual identification required perfect timing and optimal conditions. She had memorized Kellerman's height, build, and distinctive clothing to help distinguish him from his followers. As Sarah watched through her scope, she noticed something that hadn't appeared in previous surveillance reports. Several of the militants were wearing similar clothing and had adopted similar postures, possibly as a deliberate attempt to confuse potential snipers. This complication added another layer of difficulty to an already challenging shot. The wind conditions remained stable, but Sarah knew that could change at any moment. Mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable, and even a slight shift in air currents could send her bullet off target. She continued monitoring the vegetation and dust patterns visible through her scope to track any changes in wind direction. Sarah's grandfather had taught her that the mental aspect of long-range shooting was just as important as the technical skills. She focused on controlling her heart rate and breathing, entering the same meditative state she had used during countless hunting expeditions. In this state of mind, time seemed to slow down, and her senses became incredibly sharp. The moment of truth arrived when spotters confirmed that Kellerman was approaching the open area where Sarah planned to take her shot. She could see movement through her scope, but the distance made positive identification extremely difficult. The figure appeared to match Kellerman's physical characteristics, but Sarah needed absolute certainty before pulling the trigger. Agent Torres provided final confirmation based on radio intercepts and visual surveillance from multiple positions. The target was definitely Kellerman, and he was following his predicted route. Sarah had approximately 90 seconds to line up her shot before he would disappear behind cover again. Sarah made minute adjustments to her aim, accounting for the exact wind conditions at that moment. She had calculated the precise point where she needed to aim to compensate for bullet drop and drift. But the target was so small at this distance that any error would result in a complete miss. The crosshairs in her scope settled on the calculated impact point, several feet ahead of where Kellerman was walking, to account for the bullet's travel time. Sarah began controlling her breathing in the rhythm her grandfather had taught her, waiting for the perfect moment between heartbeats to squeeze the trigger. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion as Sarah applied steady pressure to the trigger. She had trained herself to follow through completely, maintaining her sight picture even after the shot to observe the impact. The rifle's recoil was substantial, but her years of experience allowed her to maintain control and track the bullet's flight. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder, and then there was an eternity of silence as the bullet traveled its impossible trajectory. Sarah kept her eye on the scope, watching the distant target area and waiting for confirmation that her shot had found its mark. The success or failure of the entire operation would be determined in the next few seconds. The bullet found its target with devastating precision. Through her scope, Sarah watched as Kellerman suddenly collapsed in the middle of the compound's central courtyard. The shot had been perfect, traveling over 1.8 miles through varying atmospheric conditions to strike exactly where she had aimed. The impossible had become reality. Chaos erupted immediately at the militant compound. Sarah could see figures running in all directions, shouting and pointing toward the mountains, but they had no idea where the shot had originated. The extreme distance and suppressed ammunition had made it virtually impossible for them to locate Sarah's position. Agent Torres coordinated the immediate response from the command post. Tactical teams began their assault on the compound within seconds of the shot, using the confusion among the militants to their advantage. The carefully planned rescue operation moved like clockwork, with each unit knowing exactly what they needed to accomplish. Sarah continued to provide overwatch support, using her scope to monitor the movements of remaining militants and relay information to the ground teams. Her elevated position gave her a unique perspective on the entire operation, allowing her to identify threats that the assault teams couldn't see from their positions. The rescue of the 3 hostages proceeded more smoothly than anyone had dared to hope. Without Kellerman's leadership, the militants struggled to coordinate their defense. Many surrendered immediately when they realized their situation was hopeless, while others fled into the maze of mining tunnels beneath the facility. Sarah watched through her scope as federal agents led the hostages to safety. The young college students appeared to be in relatively good condition, though they were clearly traumatized by their ordeal. Medical personnel immediately began treating them for dehydration and minor injuries sustained during their captivity. The tactical operation continued for several more hours as federal agents systematically cleared the compound and tunnel system. Sarah maintained her position throughout the operation, ready to provide additional sniper support if needed. Her role had evolved from marksman to strategic observer, helping coordinate the complex rescue mission. As news of the successful operation spread, Sarah began to understand the magnitude of what she had accomplished. The shot she had made was being described by ballistics experts as one of the longest confirmed sniper kills in law enforcement history. The technical difficulty of the shot, combined with the high-pressure circumstances, made it an almost mythical achievement. Agent Torres climbed back up to Sarah's position to personally thank her for her extraordinary contribution. The federal agent admitted that she had been skeptical about using a civilian marksman, but Sarah's performance had exceeded every expectation. Without her unique skills and local knowledge, the rescue operation would have been impossible. The media attention began almost immediately. News organizations from around the world wanted to interview the small-town librarian who had made an impossible shot to save 3 lives. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the sudden fame, preferring to focus on the successful rescue rather than her personal achievement. Federal investigators began a thorough examination of the compound, discovering evidence of plans for attacks on government facilities and civilian targets. Kellerman's group had been more dangerous than anyone had realized, and Sarah's decisive action had likely prevented future terrorist attacks throughout the region. The surviving militants were taken into custody and faced serious federal charges related to kidnapping, weapons violations, and conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism. The investigation revealed connections to other extremist groups, leading to additional arrests and the disruption of a larger criminal network. Sarah's role in the operation remained classified for security reasons, but word of her achievement spread through law enforcement and military circles. She received commendations from federal agencies and was quietly approached by military recruiters who recognized her exceptional abilities. The psychological impact of taking a human life, even under such circumstances, was something Sarah had to process carefully. She sought counseling to help deal with the emotional aftermath of the shooting, understanding that her actions, while necessary, had permanently changed her life. 6 months after the siege ended, life in Clearwater Valley had returned to a new normal. The mining facility on Copper Ridge had been permanently sealed, and the area was being converted into a memorial park to honor the victims of the crisis. Sarah had played a crucial role in the healing process, helping her community process the trauma they had all experienced. The 3 rescued hostages had recovered from their ordeal and returned to their studies, but they maintained contact with Sarah and the other people who had saved their lives. Their families had expressed profound gratitude for Sarah's courage and skill, understanding that without her intervention, their children would not have survived. Sarah's achievement had attracted attention from military and law enforcement agencies around the world. She received offers to join elite sniper training programs and consulting opportunities with tactical units. However, she chose to remain in Clearwater Valley, feeling that her community needed her more than any government agency. The library where Sarah worked became an unofficial pilgrimage site for marksmen and military enthusiasts who wanted to meet the woman who had made the impossible shot. She handled the attention with grace, but always emphasized that her actions were motivated by necessity rather than any desire for fame or recognition. Federal investigators had spent months analyzing Sarah's shot, using computer models and ballistic simulations to understand how she had succeeded where others might have failed. The combination of environmental factors, equipment selection, and human skill required for such an achievement was considered virtually impossible to replicate. Sarah used her newfound notoriety to advocate for better mental health, resources, and crisis intervention programs in rural communities. She had seen how quickly a peaceful area could descend into violence, and she wanted to help prevent similar situations from developing elsewhere. The investigation into Kellerman's group had revealed the extent of their planning and the scope of their intended attacks. Sarah's decisive action had prevented a much larger catastrophe that could have claimed hundreds of lives. This knowledge helped her cope with any guilt she felt about taking a life, understanding that her actions had saved many innocent people. Agent Torres had been promoted following the successful resolution of the crisis, and she maintained a professional friendship with Sarah. The federal agent often consulted with Sarah on cases involving rural extremist groups, valuing her insights into the psychology and tactics of such organizations. Sarah's grandfather would have been proud of how she had used the skills he taught her to protect her community. She often visited his grave to reflect on the lessons he had imparted and how they had prepared her for the most important moment of her life. His emphasis on precision, patience, and moral clarity had guided her actions during the crisis. The technical aspects of Sarah's shot continued to be studied by military academies and law enforcement training facilities. Her achievement had pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in long-range marksmanship, inspiring new research into ballistics and shooting techniques. Life in the library had become more interesting as Sarah occasionally received visits from researchers, journalists, and military personnel who wanted to understand her background and training. She remained committed to her work as a librarian while also serving as an unofficial consultant on crisis situations involving rural extremist groups. The memorial park on Copper Ridge was completed on the first anniversary of the siege, with Sarah participating in the dedication ceremony. The site served as a reminder of how ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges when their communities were threatened. Sarah's story became a symbol of quiet heroism and the power of specialized skills when applied in service of others. She had proven that preparation, knowledge, and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Her legacy extended far beyond the single shot that ended the siege, inspiring others to develop their own abilities and stand ready to help when their communities needed them most. The woman, who had been predicted to break under pressure, had instead demonstrated that true strength often comes from the most unexpected sources. Sarah Martinez had saved lives, ended a crisis, and shown the world that heroes can emerge from the quietest corners of society when circumstances demand extraordinary action.